In the last video, we discussed the social subordination of women and the role that it plays in helping make profits possible. There are other forms of social oppression that help sustain the general possibility of profit-making in our economies. As far back as the middle of the 19th century in Europe, people like Karl Marx could see how the precarious, insecure, and uncertain social position of Irish workers in England and Eastern European workers across Western Europe fundamentally shaped labor markets and the broader relationship between labor and capital. Immigrant workers and workers from oppressed ethnic groups found it more difficult to bargain for their interests, both because often they had the disadvantage of fewer legal rights and protections, and because they faced hostility from native-born workers as well. As a result, immigrant and minority workers typically experienced lower levels of pay, faced concentration in jobs that were less desirable, and contractual conditions that were more precarious. They became part of what Marx called the reserve armies of labor. The reserve armies of labor were buffer stocks of workers that could be mobilized when business boomed and labor markets tightened. This in turn could relieve upward pressures on wages and support profitability. Once the boom turned to bust, those reserve workers could be disposed of more easily, including sometimes by sending them back to their countries of origin. This could shield enterprises and native workers from the worst consequences of the downturn by passing its costs disproportionately to those workers in the most socially vulnerable positions. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because it is. Many immigrant and ethnic minority groups across Europe and North America find themselves in that kind of a position today. They are vulnerable because they work while having little or no legal protections, ensuring that they cannot bargain in the same way workers with legal status can. They are also vulnerable because of widespread social attitudes toward their group. Those attitudes often shape the general perception of the characteristics of individuals of those groups, the kinds of jobs they are capable of doing, and the general recognition of their contributions to productive efforts. This too results in lower levels of pay, in concentration in less desirable occupations, and generally weaker contractual terms. All of this benefits employers and potentially native-born workers of dominant ethnic groups as well. The abolition of chattel slavery in the Americas added millions of people to the reserve armies of labor, particularly in the United States and Brazil, which had the world's largest populations of enslaved people of West and Southern African origin. The abolition of slavery was not followed by systematic efforts to address the historical wrongs and legacies of slavery. Promises of access to the same economic opportunities made available to whites were soon abandoned, as were efforts to dismantle ideological systems of racial supremacy that had evolved to justify enslavement and the barbarism that it required. Instead, former slaves and their descendants were systematically marginalized economically and geographically by societies where most people fundamentally questioned their basic humanity. Societies that daily subjected them to deadly violence by state forces and non-state groups. This arrangement guaranteed that economic outcomes for the descendants of slaves were always worse than those of whites. And perversely, those outcomes would then be used to justify the arrangement in the first place. Both in Brazil and in the United States, industrialization drew those populations into the core workforces of those economies. But their precarious social positions and widespread racist attitudes among employers, fellow workers, and the public ensured that this integration was very much as a buffer stock, a mass of people who are the last to be hired during the upswing of the business cycle and the first to be fired during the downswing. Less desirable jobs, lower pay, more precarious employment. To this day, black unemployment rates in the United States and Brazil are consistently higher than average rates, and the duration of unemployment is also significantly longer. Social subordination born out of the legacies of slavery and the stubborn failures to do anything significant to address them continue to help moderate overall wage growth and to place disproportionate shares of the cost of downturns on black wage earners and on their families. This in turn can help support profitability and reduce the impact of downturns on enterprises and on white workers. This is yet another way in which our economies routinely take from a certain social group. This lesson explained how social subordination helps form what Marx called the reserve armies of labor, and how those armies can sustain profitability. In the next video, we're going to finish Module 2 by discussing 2 additional ways in which profits can be made by taking from our common social wealth.